Hello, my name is Lauren, and for this presentation, we are going to cover the intersection between cinema and mental health. This presentation will cover 4 areas of conversation. To begin, we will discuss the underlying biology of mental illness. So how do genetics and the environment play a role in its development? We'll look into 3 illnesses specifically: bipolar disorder, depression, and addiction. Next, we will explore how film may depict this, covering areas of cinematography, writing, and aesthetics. Taking that into consideration, we will look into the benefits and detriments of incorporating mental illness into film. Following this discussion, we'll take a closer look at 3 different films: Silver Linings Playbook, The Skeleton Twins, and Euphoria. Thinking about what we've learned about the portrayal of mental illness in topic 2, you can see what specific decisions these filmmakers chose to make. Finally, we will end with a screening of my short film, The 5 Steps to Cure Depression. Our first topic, the biology of mental illness. Mental illness in and of itself is a tricky concept to grasp. Despite decades of study, few concrete conclusions have been made. The fact of the matter is that underlying causes are hard to come by. This arises due to how the presentation of the diseases varies widely from person to person. Diagnosis is not as simple as checking a certain number of boxes. It is a combination of behaviors, thoughts, and feelings. Bipolar disorder can be broadly identified by the characteristics such as mood swings, irritability, manic episodes, delusion, and other similar behaviors. Depression, while being one of the most widespread mental illnesses, can be hard for an individual to identify in oneself due to its symptoms. General discomfort, guilt, restlessness, social isolation, and hopelessness are all things we struggle with on occasion. However, for those that struggle with depression, these symptoms are persistent and can lead to more dangerous responses. Addiction is another common mental illness where many of those who have it are either unaware of or do not acknowledge their state. Signs of addiction can include changes in mood, appetite, and sleep, along with engagement in risky behavior and a general loss of interest in all other things. As mentioned before, there is no one way to pinpoint a direct cause and effect when it comes to diagnosing mental illness. What we do know is that susceptibility and later diagnosis can be attributed to both genetic and environmental factors. The topic of nature versus nurture in many avenues of science has long been debated. However, when it comes to mental illness, the responsibility of both factors is easily seen. Though percentages vary depending on who you ask, some professionals deem the two to hold equal importance concerning the emergence of a mental illness. Nature refers to the genetics of mental illness. While there are a number of genes we could examine that may give us clues as to how mental illness arises biologically, I've chosen 2 to highlight here that seem to have ample links, both of which regulate the flow of calcium to neurons. If you're not familiar with the role of calcium in neuron firing, it's basically deemed as the ultimate multitasker in the brain. Most importantly, it aids in the propagation of electrical signals down the axon. At the area where the 2 neurons meet, there are synaptic terminals and synapses. Think of them like a train stop. The train, otherwise known as the axon, carries a signal down the tracks. When it reaches a stop, the signal gets off and continues on to a new destination. Essentially, neurons run on calcium, is what allows the transfer of signals throughout the brain. It's also crucial in memory formation, metabolism, and cell growth. So if we have a variation in a gene that regulates the flow of calcium, we have an issue. Changes in the gene CAC and A1C have been found to impact brain circulatory involving emotion, thinking, attention, and memory. It also has links to bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, and major depression. CAC and B2, also a gene regulating calcium flow, has been seen to have similar effects and is linked to all 5 of the main disorders: autism, ADHD, bipolar, major depressive, and schizophrenia. Variations in chromosomes 3 and 10 have also been found by scientists to have possible links to bipolar and schizophrenia, though these examples are just a few among many, and it is beyond doubt that there's still more to be discovered. But we cannot simply stop at the genetic nature of a mental illness. As put by Dr. Jordan Smaller, although statistically significant, each of these genetic associations individually can only account for a small amount of risk for mental illness. 1 or 2 variations have not been found to directly be the end-all be-all of diagnosing a mental illness. And beyond these variations, we must also consider the role of the environment. Nurture, or the environment an individual has experienced throughout their lifetime, also plays a significant part in the development of mental illness. ACEs is a concept that researchers are beginning to pay more attention to when it comes to mental illness diagnosis and risk. The acronym stands for Adverse Childhood Experiences and can include violence, abuse, neglect, substance use, all that take place during an individual's early life. ACEs have been found to have lasting negative effects on health, well-being, and life opportunities. Additionally, life events like domestic violence, abuse, trauma, sudden deaths, and others have a hand in causing or triggering mental disorders. As put by Dr. Thomas Sinsel, It is not a question of genes versus environment. It is a question of how genes interact with whatever the environmental factors might be. And that's probably true of all the disorders that we call mental illness. There is no clear answer, but decades of research have indicated that there are many potential factors that may contribute to the diseases we will cover in this presentation. So stigma is going to be a large topic of conversation when discussing the portrayal of mental illness in media. So before moving on to the film aspect of this conversation, it's important that we get some stats out there. Despite being widely avoided in conversation due to fear of a negative reaction, mental illness is very common in the general population. It has been found that 26% of adults over 18 will suffer from a diagnosable mental illness in any given year. And more than 50% of Americans will be diagnosed with a mental illness at some point in their lifetime. So while the topic of mental illness may seem uncomfortable or isolating, it's actually a much more widespread phenomenon than many might believe. As such, it is crucial that we approach the topic in a responsible way, particularly when considering a medium as widespread as film and TV. This brings us to our next section on the impact of film on mental illness. First of all, it's necessary that we briefly break down a few of the many layers of film production. While the audience may only see the finished product in the final stage of its making, there are many steps leading up to that presentation that influence the way a film has been made. In the category of cinematography, aspects like lenses, camera movement, shutter speed, rules of composition, and depth of field all play a hand in formulating the emotional reaction of an audience. A filmmaker can target objects in a scene she wants you to pay most attention to, and can easily emulate discomfort or suspicion in the audience by playing with the composition of the shot or the lens the scene is filmed with. The following are a few examples of how cinematography might influence an audience's perception. So leaving lots of negative space, such as the still from Mr. Robot in the top left corner or Punch Drunk Love in the bottom left, suggests isolation or an intense emotional space. The framing does not seem quite right to what we expect, so it's a useful tool to shake your audience when you want to emphasize an emotion. Low angles, like the still from Psycho, imbue unease. It's an unnatural angle and is often used to imply that something is not quite right. Additionally, extreme close-ups like the bottom right are embedded in film to draw the attention of an audience to one specific object, whether it be a face or something else. Remaining on the shot for extended periods of time can also emit a strong reaction in your audience or imply significance in the scene. Writing, while perhaps the most unnoticed stage of film production by the general audience, also has an important role. The author of a script controls its creation. The characters are born from Hermione, such as hefty control over how the later stages of production view the personalities in front of the camera. Pieces of a script like character description, dialogue, action lines, parentheticals, and intended delivery by the actor are the first impression a director and filmmaker will have on the story. As such, the writer has an incredible amount of power to mold the unique characteristics of each individual in the film. Finally, the ties that pull everything together in a film, the aesthetics. Similar to cinematography, while underlying aesthetics of film are not meant to be consciously perceived by the audience, in many cases, they are astoundingly important. Aspects from lighting to color scheme, mise-en-scene, makeup, costume, or music do an excellent job at molding the audience's initial response to a character or location. Colors have unique subconscious connections to emotions, such as yellow for happiness or green for envy. Makeup can also be incredibly illuminating, contrasting characters that are perfectly done up versus those that have less of a put-together appearance can either play along with stereotypes or counter them. We can take a closer look at lighting here to see how it impacts a scene. So the ambient lighting in the top left frame with the green-yellow tints is well suited for the fantasy world of Harry Potter, and the hardly lit subject in the frame suggests suspense or mystery. Practical lighting, such as in the top right shot, can be used in a multitude of ways, giving the scene a more sensual or natural feel. The bottom two frames are both from the same movie, Casablanca, and here we can see that the use of soft lighting on the subject on the left highlights her innocence and beauty. On the right, our subject is cast in a hard light. This gives us more of an intense feeling, like he has a difficult choice to make. Craig Benzine, an American videographer, defines film perfectly as a universal language that tells us stories about our collective hopes and fears to make sense of the world around us and the people around us. When we have not interacted directly with a person, culture, or location, we're very impressionable about its characteristics. Film, as Benzine notes, can aid us in making sense of what we do not know. However, with this power comes the necessity to use it in an educated and responsible way. So, then, how might film benefit fighting the issues surrounding the topic of mental illness? To begin, there's a lot of stigma surrounding those who suffer. These stigmas perpetuate misunderstanding and can lead to the objectification of people as dangerous or incompetent. Isolation is already a struggle for many of those who suffer from a mental illness, so it's best not to intensify those feelings. Film, when created responsibly and accurately, can address stigmas about mental illness and aid in the elimination of them. Additionally, film has the unique widespread potential of normalizing these illnesses. Being such a global method of distribution of information, cinema has the unique ability to breach a topic for millions of people. It can contrast the perception that these illnesses are shameful or not normal, which we know to be false after learning earlier that half of us will encounter mental illness at one point or another during our lifetime. Beyond eliminating stigma and normalizing these diseases, film also has the potential to introduce contact in a sense. We're often wary of things we do not know or cannot understand. So, when offered the opportunity to learn about mental illness through film, an audience can connect with the character suffering from depression, or bipolar, schizophrenia, or any other disorder, and in turn begin to understand more about what it is like to live in their shoes. But where there are benefits, there also come detriments. As mentioned before, film and TV have a unique ability to influence the perception of reality of a large scale of people. It shapes, or in the very least, adds to your knowledge of the world. In this sense, the benefits of addressing mental illness in film can just as easily become disadvantageous when the topic is presented inaccurately. A film can spread misinformation, reinforce stereotypes, heighten stigma, and introduce superficial takes on very important topics. As put by Daz et al., we begin to run into problems when, in an attempt to popularize themes among viewers, filmmakers largely focus on unipolar conflicts rather than taking an overall view. When dealing with themes surrounding mental illness, there is no pick and choose. While depicting a schizophrenic as the villain in a story can intensify key emotional responses like suspense and thrill in an audience, it's unfair to only present the illness from a narrowed point of focus. There are many layers to mental illness, and addressing the most extreme of them without also humanizing the character and closely covering their own fears and struggles is irresponsible and damaging. Now that we've briefly addressed the biology of mental illness and the ways it can be portrayed in film, we're going to take a closer look at three specific diseases: bipolar disorder, depression, and addiction, along with three pieces of film or TV that attempt to address them. To start, we will examine how Silver Linings Playbook depicts bipolar disorder. For context, the film's logline is as follows: newly released from a mental institution and having lost everything after an incident, bipolar Pat Solitino meets a crazy young widow and thinks he has found a way to win back his estranged wife and rebuild his life. But when the time comes to put his plan into practice, he learns that you have to let some dreams die in order to get the best prize. There are a few key techniques in cinematography that Silver Linings Playbook uses when depicting Pat in his bipolar states, the first of which is the use of montage with quick camera movements and shaky composition. When Pat begins to transition into his angry or obsessive states, we are given the impression first by a series of quick montage-like shots. Quick 2 or so second clips show him becoming more frantic with passing time. In accordance with this shift, the camera begins to move quicker and the composition drifts in and out of being static. Another technique the filmmakers use are quick zooms. Beginning with a close-up, then transitioning to a medium shot or vice versa, it is as though the audience can hear the snap when Pat allows himself to be consumed by those intense emotions. We are jolted, in a sense, into his new reality. When it comes to the visual aspects of the film, they are largely natural. There are a few extreme color or lighting shifts associated with Pat's fluxes in behavior. The narrative is primarily shown through composition instead. We never seem to remain comfortably in the same frame of reference during Pat's bipolar attacks. Our second movie is The Skeleton Twins, which examines depression through the characters Milo and Maggie. The logline for this film is: when estranged twins Maggie and Milo feel that they are at the end of their ropes, an unexpected reunion forces them to confront why their lives went so wrong. As the twins reconnect, they realize the key to fixing their lives may just lie in repairing their relationship. There are a number of ways the dialogue itself in The Skeleton Twins alludes to the issues Maggie and Milo face, but the more subtle use of cinematography cues tie the movie together. Milo has felt rejected his entire life. From his high school English teacher to his failed acting career, he's forced himself into isolation. When a failed suicide attempt causes him to move in with his estranged sister Maggie, his depressive tendencies come to light. For the beginning of the film, Milo hardly talks with another character face to face. Whether his back is turned, his face pointed away, or eyes locked on some other object in the room, Milo excludes himself from the conversation. His sister Maggie, who was also contemplating suicide before she got the call her brother was in the hospital, displays her depression in a different way. Primarily, she turns to alcohol and hookups outside of her marriage. During the conflict with her mother, the camera immediately shifts to handheld. It's jerky as it follows her movement and mirrors her mental state as she lets the anger deep within her spill out for once. After this turning point, we saw the secrets Maggie has been keeping come to light as she confides in her brother. Taking place in upstate New York during its colder months, the color and lighting of the film is natural and matter of fact. It suits the mood and reflects Milo and Maggie's mental state. The composition of the film remains primarily static. Held in place, it allows characters to move fully in or out of frame before following. They push from full to medium to close shots in order as Milo or Maggie feel more unraveled. For the topic of addiction, we will be examining the hit TV show Euphoria. Euphoria follows a group of high school students as they navigate drugs, sex, identity, trauma, social media, love, and friendship. The story follows our narrator, Rue, presented from her perspective. Rue is a drug addict attempting to recover from the premature loss of her father. In these states where Rue has turned to drugs for comfort, we see a lower shutter speed suggesting her drug-induced state. The world moves fast around Rue while she moves slow. Aligning with the name of the show, these scenes seem euphoric and calm, exactly how Rue wants to be. The filmmakers also use whip pans and overlapping sequences quite often to jump between storylines. As a piece of Rue's unreliable narration, the show jumps between shots of what Rue tells us happened, and we're forced to keep up with the pace of her mind. It jolts us between Rue's drug goggles and the more quote unquote realistic sequences from the perspective of the other characters. We get consistent, quick comparisons between what Rue feels like on drugs and the sadness of the life she is trying to avoid. Euphoria's visual is part of what made it such a popular show. Since it revolves around drug use, sex, trauma, and a host of other intense life events, the aesthetics of the TV show reflect that. The colors, while Rue is high or others are intoxicated, are attention-grabbing, saturated, and electric. It illuminates how Rue's mind works on drugs. The lighting is low lit and sensual, matching the sexual nature of the show. The characters are all seeking euphoric highs in one sense or another, and the lighting resonates with this. The composition of the show is never quite consistent. Rue's mental state changes with each scene, and so does the way in which she is captured on camera. If we narrow down our attention to when she's high, however, we find that the camera typically remains tight on the center of focus, then drifts out and travels alongside Rue. Many of the sequences seem continuous, with many of the characters being in the same place at the same time, so we flow between all of them, following Rue's narrative. Finally, to round off my exploration of cinema and mental health, I decided to take what I observed from the case studies and make my own short film titled The 5 Steps to Cure Depression. It follows a 20-something-year-old college student throughout her day as she attempts to follow a WikiHow's 5 steps to fix what she feels is wrong with her. Taking what I learned from examining other films, there are some distinct choices I made in the cinematography, writing, and aesthetics of my film. For my scenes, I pulled some influence from Euphoria and the Skeleton Twins concerning my composition and camera movement. Comprised of long static shots framed on her face, transitions from blur to clear focus, and slowed down idealizations of what she thinks a non-depressed day should look like. We feel isolation, for example, when she's in the living room with her friends, and the shot is pulling her out of the group. For the writing, I used specific words to infuse emotion into the page, so small facial movements were highlighted to emphasize the theme built into the cinematography and aesthetics. I focus on taking what I imagined she would be thinking and transcribing it in a way that can be physically viewed by the audience. The aesthetics of the film pull from Silver Linings Playbook and the Skeleton Twins. My color scheme is bland and neutral. Most pops of color are reserved for her idealized fantasies where the world is brighter and cleaner. I also took inspiration in costuming from these films, with her wardrobe very bland and based on comfort, kind of just what she would, pull out of the bottom of her closet. She always seems just a bit messy, hinting at what's going on inside her head. And finally, before we move on to the film, here is a list of references for this portion of the presentation.